At a family birthday party, my daughter-in-law, Sienna Price Baylor, called security and screamed in front of everyone, "Get this poor old woman away from the table!" She had no idea that the poor old woman she was insulting was actually the founder and chairwoman of Lakefront Dynamics, the very company where she worked as a marketing manager. The next day, when I walked into the office, all it took was one single decision to put her right where she belonged, the dishwashing room in the basement. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, to see what drove a mother, a businesswoman like me, to teach her own daughter-in-law a lesson about respect and human worth. And before we move on to the next part, leave a comment with the name of your city. I'd love to see how far this story has reached. I should have known something was wrong the moment I rang the doorbell. Usually, it would be Malcolm, my son, who opened the door, wearing that warm smile I had loved since he was a little boy. But this time, it was Sienna Price Baylor who appeared. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the doorknob as if she were the true owner of this house, and perhaps in her mind she was, "Oh, you're here," she said. Her voice carried that familiar tone, the one reserved just for me, polite enough not to be called rude, yet cold enough to make me feel like an unwelcome guest. I tightened my hold on the gift bag in my hands. Inside was a hand-knitted sweater for Cameron, the birthday gift I had spent weeks finishing. Every stitch, every strand of yarn carried the love of a grandmother for her only grandson. "Hello, Sienna. I brought Cameron's birthday present," I said softly. She didn't step aside to let me in. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, pausing on the simple black dress, the nicest one I owned, though clearly not up to standard by her measure. "Malcolm's still getting ready. The other guests are already here," she said. The other guests? I froze. Malcolm had called me just last week, saying it would be a small family dinner for Cameron's 5th birthday, standing on that doorstep. A memory from 20 years ago suddenly came rushing back. I remembered 8-year-old Malcolm hugging me tight after his first day at Kenwood Academy, whispering through tears, "I only need you, Mom. You're the best person in the world." Back then, we lived in a small apartment on the South Side. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices in the morning, cashiering at a supermarket in the afternoon, and doing laundry on weekends. No matter how exhausted I was, every night I would sit beside my boy, check his homework, and tell him my dream, that one day I would build my own company so my son would never have to struggle again. I still remembered when 10-year-old Malcolm once asked, "Why do my friends say we're poor, Mom?" I hugged him tightly. "Being poor in money isn't the scary part, son. Being poor in love and determination is. I'll show you. If we work hard enough, we can change everything." When I finally stepped inside, the living room glittered with the light of a crystal chandelier. Elegant couples mingled under the cold gleam of diamonds. Their laughter filled the air, the kind that belongs to people convinced their stories are more important than anyone else's. I recognized a few faces I'd seen in the Chicago Tribune Society section. "Grandma Ruth Ann!" Cameron's voice rang out, bright as sunlight cutting through gray clouds. He ran to me and threw his arms around my neck. In that moment, every ounce of tension melted away. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered. "I have something special for you." But before I could take the gift out, Sienna's hand landed on her son's shoulder. "Cameron, remember what we talked about? Grandma needs to wash her hands first. Why don't you go play with your cousins?" Her tone was gentle, but her message was clear. I wasn't clean enough to touch her child. Across the room, I caught Malcolm's eyes. He was standing among a group of men discussing the stock market. For a second, I saw my little boy again, the same warm eyes, the shy smile. But then Sienna brushed past, lightly touching her husband's arm. The smile vanished. Malcolm lowered his gaze, avoiding my eyes, as if I were a stranger. Something cracked inside me, not a sharp, loud break, but a spreading fracture, like hairline cracks across glass. The dining table seemed endless, laid with fine china I'd never seen before, probably a wedding gift from Sienna's family. They seated me at the far end, wedged between an empty chair and Malcolm's old college friend, who spent the entire meal boasting about his latest business deal. Malcolm glanced at me once as the appetizers were served. He smiled faintly, but when Sienna leaned over and whispered something in his ear, the smile disappeared. My heart sank a little deeper. "So, Mrs. Ruth Ann." Sienna's voice rose clearly over the table during the main course, silencing every conversation. "Malcolm tells me you're still running that little cleaning company of yours, right?" She dragged out the word little, as if it were something dirty. A few guests turned to look at me, curiosity and pity flickering in their eyes. My cheeks burned. "I run a business," I said quietly, keeping my tone steady, unwilling to cause a scene. Sienna laughed, a bright, tinkling laugh that sounded like shards of glass clinking together. "Oh, how adorable! A business," she said, turning to the woman beside her with mock sweetness. "Mrs. Ruth Ann runs an office cleaning service, a very modest profession." The woman gave a polite smile, but I caught the subtle way she leaned slightly away. That unconscious reflex of people who believe they're sitting next to someone beneath them. I tried to keep eating, but every bite felt like swallowing sand. As I listened to them discuss their Hamptons villas and private schools, I realized the truth. To them, I wasn't family. I was just a seat filler, there to make the table look complete. And I didn't know then that after that very night, everything in this house and in Sienna's life was about to turn completely upside down. Everything collapsed the moment dessert was served. Cameron had escaped from the kids' table and climbed onto my lap, his tiny hands sticky with chocolate. "Grandma, tell me the story about the princess who saved herself." That was our tradition, a story I had made up years ago about a princess who didn't need anyone to rescue her because she was smart, brave, and strong enough to rise on her own. Each time I told it, Cameron added something new. Sometimes the princess had a dragon friend. Sometimes she brewed magic potions. It was our secret, an invisible thread connecting 2 generations. But before I could even begin, Sienna Price Baylor shot up from her chair, her face flushed red with fury. "Cameron, get down right now!" Her voice was so sharp it could have shattered glass. "But, Mommy, I want to hear Grandma's story." "Now!" She yanked the boy off my lap, so harshly that Cameron began to cry in fright. Then she turned to me, her eyes blazing. "I think it's time for you to leave." The room fell dead silent. Even the loud man who had been bragging all evening froze mid-sentence. I felt 20 pairs of eyes on me, curious, awkward, tinged with pity. Everyone watched as I was humiliated in front of them, at my own grandson's birthday party. "Sienna, please." I tried to keep my voice calm, barely above a whisper. "This is Cameron's birthday." "Security!" she suddenly shouted, though there wasn't any security staff in the house. "Can someone please escort this woman out? She's disrupting my family's dinner." Malcolm rose slowly, his face pale. "Sienna, that's my mother." "Your mother," she repeated, each word cutting like a knife, "does not belong at this table. A table for decent people. Look at her, Malcolm. She's making you ashamed, making us ashamed, making your son ashamed." That was the moment I knew I would never forget, for as long as I lived. I looked into the eyes of the boy I had once held in my arms, the boy I had raised to respect others, the boy I had worked 3 jobs to feed and educate, and my son stayed silent. Malcolm lowered his eyes to his plate. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me. In that moment, I didn't just lose my son. I lost my faith, the belief that love could overcome anything. I began to doubt myself. Wondering if I had failed as a mother, I don't remember how I stood up or how I walked to the door. All I remember was the pounding of my heart and the heavy breath that filled my chest as I passed through the sea of staring eyes. At the doorway, I turned back, hoping Malcolm would look at me, just once, hoping he would say something, anything. But he didn't. He just stared at his empty plate. The door closed behind me with a sharp click. Final, like the end of a sentence. The autumn night air in Chicago cut through my skin as I opened my car door. My hands trembled so badly, I dropped my keys twice. When I finally sat behind the wheel, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Ruth Ann Baylor, 68 years old. Silver hair slightly disheveled from an unfinished hug, wearing her best black dress, which now looked like a torn piece of cloth. I looked exactly like what Sienna had called me, a poor old woman who didn't know her place. But inside my purse was my phone, and in that phone was the number of Keisha Randall, my assistant of 15 years at Lakefront Dynamics. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into 300 North LaSalle, ride the elevator to the 42nd floor, and sit behind the mahogany desk in my corner office, the one I had spent half my life building. As for Sienna Price Baylor, she would be sleeping soundly in her Kenwood home, believing she was a talented marketing manager climbing the corporate ladder through her cleverness and charm. She had no idea that the woman she had just humiliated was the same person who signed her paycheck every month. I didn't drive off immediately. I just sat there, surrounded by the quiet of the city night, watching the empty street ahead. The lights from the high-rise windows shimmered on the Chicago River like scattered shards of glass. A middle-aged woman passed by, walking her dog slowly, hands in her coat pockets, peaceful and unbothered. That simple scene made me realize something. I had spent my entire life trying to earn other people's respect, forgetting that I had always been the one most deserving of it. I took a deep breath and started the engine. The sound was soft, but steady, like a promise to myself. I drove through the quiet streets of Chicago, my hands no longer trembling. The feeling of humiliation began to dissolve, replaced by resolve. Sienna wanted to teach me about knowing my place. Fine. Tomorrow I would teach her that lesson, in a way she would never forget. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling as images replayed like a slow-motion film. Cameron crying as he was pulled from my arms. Malcolm looking down, silent. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on me, and Sienna's laughter, sharp and brittle, like glass breaking. Then another memory surfaced. 30 years ago, Malcolm had fallen off his bike and scraped his knee. Another child laughed at him. "Poor kid, your bike's so old." Malcolm didn't cry from pain. He cried from shame. I had held him close and said, "My love, a person's worth isn't in what they have, but in what they give. One day, you'll understand. Kindness is always worth more than money." But now, my son had married a woman who believed money was everything, and let her drag him down with her. At 3 a.m, I sat up, turned on the light, and opened my laptop. If I was going to do this, I would do it right. Not out of revenge, but to restore justice. I logged into Lakefront Dynamics' internal system, using the CEO's security credentials, and began typing the name, Sienna Price Baylor. The investigation began. At 6:30 a.m, I arrived at Lakefront Dynamics, 2 hours earlier than usual. The building at 300 North LaSalle stood silent in the dawn light. Its glass facade reflected the pale sky like a colossal mirror. 35 years ago, I built this company from nothing. Back then, people laughed at the idea of a woman starting a business in tech. Now we employed more than 2,000 people across 3 states. Dwayne Whitfield, the security guard, looked surprised to see me. "Good morning, Mrs. Baylor. You're in early today." "Couldn't sleep, Dwayne," I replied, and that was the truth. My corner office occupied the entire northeast side of the 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Chicago, but this morning I wasn't in the mood to admire it. I sat down, powered up my computer, and went straight into the employee database. Sienna Price Baylor, Marketing Manager, Digital Campaigns Department, hired 18 months ago. Her profile photo appeared with that same smug smile. identical to the expression she wore last night when she called me a poor old woman. According to her record, Sienna had impressed recruiters with her dynamic personality and innovative approach to client engagement. Her salary was high enough that most employees would have to work 2 years to earn the same. I dug deeper. Performance reviews, project assignments, peer feedback, and my stomach tightened. 3 formal complaints in just 1 year, all from older employees. Complaint 1, Margaret Chen, 61, Accounting Department. Sienna publicly humiliated her during a budget meeting, calling her methods outdated and suggesting she step aside for someone who understands modern business. Result? Dismissed. Sienna claimed she was simply advocating for efficiency. Complaint 2, Robert Williams, 58, IT support. Sienna forced him to work overtime on her personal projects, calling him slow and unable to keep up with young minds. Result? Dismissed again. Her supervisor praised her for maintaining high standards. Complaint 3, Lorraine Jeffers, 63, janitorial supervisor. Sienna complained to HR that Lorraine was unprofessional and failed to follow basic instructions after being unable to reschedule a room cleaning on Sienna's last-minute request. Result: Lorraine was reassigned to the night shift. I leaned back, a cold fury spreading through my chest. This wasn't just about last night. This was a pattern. Sienna targeted older employees, used her position to demean them, and relied on the company's fear of conflict to escape consequences. And I, the CEO, had no idea it was happening right under my nose. My phone buzzed. Malcolm. Mom, I'm sorry about last night. Sienna, she was stressed about the party. She didn't mean it. She called for security to throw me out of Cameron's birthday party, Malcolm. Mom, there wasn't any real security. She just overreacted. She humiliated me in front of 20 people. A long silence. I know, I should have said something. I'm sorry. But you didn't. I need some time to think, Malcolm. Okay, but Mom, maybe next time you could dress a bit more presentably? Sienna's friends really care about appearances. I hung up. My son, the same boy who once rescued injured birds, who used to share his lunch with classmates, now wanted me to adapt to his wife's cruelty. By 8 o'clock, the building was coming alive. I stood by the window, watching people file into elevators. Somewhere among them was Sienna, probably telling her version of the story about her difficult mother-in-law. I dialed Keisha Randall, my executive assistant for 15 years. She'd started as a secretary and worked her way up. Keisha was 62, the exact kind of employee Sienna liked to target. Keisha, I need you to quietly pull some files for me. Yes, ma'am. Which ones? Start with digital campaigns, all performance reviews, project reports, internal communications, especially anything that mentions interactions with older employees. Keisha hesitated for half a second, the sign she knew something serious was happening. Do I need to know what this is about, Mrs. Baylor? Not yet, but I think we're about to change a few things around here. While waiting for her, I opened an old folder, photos from the day we launched the very first office. There I was, standing in front of a makeshift sign, with my first 3 employees behind me, one white, one black, one Asian, all older than I was at the time. They were the ones who believed in me when no one else did. I closed the folder. Today, no one like them would ever be disrespected on my watch again. An hour later, Keisha returned with a thick stack of folders, and everything inside confirmed my fears. Sienna's department had the highest turnover rate in the entire company, especially among employees over 50. Exit interviews showed a clear pattern: age discrimination, hostile environment, yet somehow those reports never reached my desk. Among the printed emails, one exchange made my hands tremble with anger. Can't believe they're making me work with Lorraine on the Morrison project. The woman barely knows how to use a smartphone. Why do we keep these dinosaurs around? They just take up space meant for people who actually understand modern workplaces. The Morrison project. the same campaign Sienna took credit for, and received a massive bonus. Lorraine Jeffers, 63, the woman forced onto the night shift, was the one who had pitched the original concept during the team brainstorm. I picked up the phone and dialed extension 4247, HR Andretta Miles speaking. Andretta, this is Ruth Ann Baylor. I need you in my office immediately. Bring the org chart for the digital campaigns department. 20 minutes later, Andretta sat across from me, her face pale as I explained, Mrs. Baylor, I didn't realize things were this serious. Some of these complaints should have gone directly to you. Exactly, but they didn't. That means we have a systemic problem, not just a bad employee. But for now, I want to focus on Sienna Price Baylor. Andretta swallowed hard. What do you want me to do, ma'am? I leaned forward, every thought crystallizing. I want an immediate transfer today. Transfer? To which department? I thought of Lorraine, forced into night shifts just for being inconvenient. Of Margaret, humiliated in public even though her work was flawless. Of Robert, exploited for extra hours yet called slow. To food services, dishwashing position. Andretta's eyes widened. Mrs. Baylor, that's a major demotion. She'll definitely file a complaint. Then tell her it's a new initiative. Management cross-training executives must understand operations firsthand. Temporary, pending departmental restructuring. And if she refuses? I smiled, not kindly. Then she's free to find another company that appreciates her dynamic personality. The bell had been struck, and I was going to pull the rope myself. The basement cafeteria of Lakefront Dynamics was always loud, the roar of an industrial dishwasher mixing with steam and the smell of hot food. It was where humble but honest work happened, where no one noticed the people who kept the entire building running smoothly. I stood in the service corridor, wearing a maintenance uniform borrowed from facilities. At 68, it was easy to blend in with the older janitorial staff. My silver hair was tucked neatly under a baseball cap, and in my hand was a clipboard, the perfect prop for this morning's role. Through the small pass window into the kitchen, I saw Sienna Price Baylor. She'd been down here for 3 days now, and she was clearly struggling. The hands that once received meticulous care were now chipped, slick with soap. The hairnet flattened her blonde hair to a damp sheen, and her face was set in a hard mask of anger, the kind of anger that made people instinctively keep their distance. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to Carla Brooks, the woman washing beside her. "I have a master's in marketing. I've managed campaigns worth millions, and now they make me wash dishes like a regular person?" Carla cut in, her voice sharp. She was about 55, her hands calloused from years of honest labor. "You think this work makes us less than you?" Sienna flushed. "That's not what I meant. I'm just saying I'm qualified for something better." "We're all qualified for something, sweetheart," said Lorraine Jeffers from the prep counter, her gaze steady. I recognized her immediately, the woman Sienna had pushed onto the night shift. But there is dignity in every honest job. Sienna rolled her eyes as Lorraine turned away. Easy for her to say. She's probably done this her whole life. I tightened my grip on the clipboard. Even here, even at the bottom rung, she couldn't restrain her contempt. I left the cafeteria and walked down the narrow corridor to the walk-in coolers. The scent of disinfectant and cooking oil mingled in the air, pulling me back to years spent in rooms just like this. Before the company, before the reputation. There is a truth people like Sienna will never understand. No one belongs to a lowly job, but anyone can choose to do it with self-respect. The next morning, I decided to get closer. Lunchtime was ideal. The noise and chaos of the cafeteria would cover everything. I took a mop and stepped toward the dish pit where Sienna was working. She looked worn out, hair limp, dark circles stark beneath her eyes. "Excuse me," I said, roughening my voice. "I need to mop around your station." "Do whatever, just don't get in my way," she snapped, not bothering to look up. I crouched to mop, close enough to hear her conversation with Jamal Pierce, the gentle young man who had been helping her these past few days. "I don't understand why they're making me do this," Sienna grumbled, scraping plates far too hard. "It has to be that old HR lady. She's never liked me." "Andretta? She's fair," Jamal said. "Maybe it's just temporary, like they said." "Temporary, my foot!" Sienna hissed. "This is punishment for something. I just don't know what." She jerked her chin toward the others. "Look at them! Look at this place! I don't belong here!" "Hey," Jamal said softly. "People here work hard. They're kind, too." Sienna let out a dry laugh. "Kind? Jamal, wake up. These are failures. Not smart enough to do anything better. They're here because they don't have any other options." My hand froze midair. A chill ran down my spine. "That one," Sienna continued, pointing toward Lorraine, "probably didn't even finish high school. And that woman with the weird accent, I'd bet she's undocumented. They should be grateful they even have jobs." Jamal frowned. "Sienna, that's not right." "It's just reality. Some people are born to lead, some are born to serve. Some create value, some are just maintenance labor." Maintenance labor. The very people keeping this entire company running, and to her, they were merely labor. I quietly kept mopping as Sienna spewed poison, sneering at Carla, sniping at Lorraine. All of it steady, unfeeling, like habit. Amid the clatter of dishes, I heard Lorraine's laugh roll out from the prep counter, low, warm, genuine. The laugh of someone who'd worked a lifetime and kept her goodness intact, I thought. If Sienna could hear that sound with her heart instead of her prejudice, maybe she would be different. But she didn't. And perhaps she couldn't. "The worst part," Sienna said, scrubbing a stack of plates, "is that my mother-in-law is probably enjoying this. She's probably sitting in her little apartment, laughing at me being taken down a peg." I went still. My blood went cold. Even now, in the wreckage she'd created, she was searching for someone else to blame. "Your mother-in-law?" Jamal asked. "Yes. That old woman thinks the world owes her something just because she's lived a long time. She showed up at my kid's birthday dressed like a garage sale, embarrassed my husband I had to ask her to leave. In Sienna's retelling, she was the victim, the brave woman defending her family. No mention of the public humiliation, no mention of calling for security." "She sounds difficult," Jamal murmured. "Bitter and jealous," Sienna said, smug satisfaction dripping from every word. "She spent her life doing manual labor and can't stand that her son married someone educated, with class. She wants to drag us down to her level." Manual labor, the job she was doing now, the job everyone around her did with pride. As I prepared to leave, Sienna's voice rose again. "You know what's funniest? My husband thinks I should apologize to her. He actually pities that old woman." "Maybe you should talk to her," Jamal said quietly. "Family matters, after all." Sienna's laugh rang out, sharp and cold, like metal striking metal. "Family? Real family doesn't show up looking like they crawled out of a trailer park. Real family knows social boundaries." I stepped out of the kitchen quickly, before my hands started to shake again. I sat in the service corridor, took off the cap, and smoothed back my sweat-damp silver hair. 3 days of observation, 3 days working beside the people she once despised, 3 days to see whether she would learn anything about humility. And the answer was no. If anything had changed, it was only that her contempt had deepened. That evening, Malcolm called again. "Mom, I'm worried about Sienna. She's exhausted from this new job. She thinks someone at the company is targeting her, discrimination or something. She says she wants to apologize to you." I almost laughed. An apology aimed more at optics than at truth. "Tell her I'm not ready to talk." "Please, Mom, she's really stressed." "Malcolm, do you know what Sienna's new job is?" "She said it's cross-training, to understand different departments." I smiled thinly. "Then I'm sure she's learning a lot." That night, I sat in my quiet apartment, the city lights washing the walls. I thought about the woman I'd observed for 3 days tomorrow. I would reveal everything. Tomorrow, Sienna would learn that the pitiful old woman she had humiliated was the one holding her career in her hands. But tonight, I allowed myself a deep, restful sleep. The peaceful sleep of someone who has fought for what is right, not for revenge, but for justice. And before I closed my eyes, I wondered, tomorrow, when she realizes that everything she believes about power and status has just been turned upside down, will she choose to learn or to deny it? I arrived at the office earlier than usual. A sleepless night had crystallized my decision. Nearly a week of observation was enough to prove what I suspected. Sienna had learned no empathy from her stint in the kitchen. All she had gathered was resentment. Keisha looked up as I stepped through the door and immediately registered the resolve in my shoulders. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Baylor?" "I need you to schedule a meeting, Sienna Price Baylor, my office, 10 o'clock. I paused at the threshold. "And Keisha, make sure she takes the main elevators. I want her to walk past the entire executive floor." Right at 10, Keisha's voice came through the intercom. "Mrs. Baylor, your 10 o'clock is here. Send her in." I turned my chair toward the window, back to the door, and listened to heels strike the marble floor. Sienna's silhouette darkened the glass. Hair that was usually immaculate now scraped into a hasty ponytail. Designer outfits replaced by plain kitchen attire, her face carved with fatigue and barely suppressed irritation. "Excuse me," she said, with that familiar irritable tone. "I was told someone wanted to talk about a transfer. I don't know why they dragged me up to the executive floor. There's clearly been a mistake." I slowly swiveled the chair. Recognition flashed across her eyes. Confusion melting into shock, then hardening into horror. "Hello, Sienna." Her mouth opened and closed twice before sound emerged. How did you get in here?" "I came in through my own entrance like every morning." I tilted a hand toward the chair opposite. "Sit down. We have a lot to discuss." She stayed standing, her features cycling like a slot machine. Disbelief, anger, fear, calculation. "This must be a joke. You cannot be the CEO." "Founder and CEO of Lakefront Dynamics," I finished for her. 35 years, Sienna." She sagged into the chair. "But at dinner, you said you worked for a cleaning company." "I said I owned a business. You were the one who decided it must be a cleaning company." I leaned back and met her eyes. People tend to see what they want to see, don't they? She stayed silent for a long moment, mind clearly whirring at full speed. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, softer, laced with the charm that had helped her climb. "Mrs. Baylor, I had no idea who you were. If I'd known—" "You would have behaved differently," I cut in. "Interesting. So your treatment of me rests entirely on the status you thought I had." Color rose in her face. "That's not what I meant." "Then what exactly did you mean?" She straightened her back, switching tactics. "Clearly there's been a misunderstanding. Family is complicated. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, people say things they don't mean." "Oh, so calling security to throw me out of my grandson's birthday was just a slip of the tongue?" She swallowed. "I was stressed about the party. Everything had to be perfect, and my presence made it less perfect," I said evenly. I pulled up her employee file on the screen. "Sienna, do you remember Margaret Chen?" "Who?" "Margaret Chen, 61, accounting. You publicly humiliated her in a budget meeting, said she should make room for someone who understands modern business." Sienna's eyes flicked around, searching for an exit that didn't exist. "That was a professional disagreement. Business requires directness." "And Robert Williams?" "It's support. You had him work overtime on your personal projects while calling him unable to keep up with the young." "I have high standards." "And Lorraine Jeffers, you complained she was unprofessional because she couldn't rearrange a schedule at your last-minute whim. Result? Night shift." The polish on her composure began to crack. What do those have to do with anything? They're legitimate workplace issues. I turned the monitor toward her and laid it out plainly. 3 formal age discrimination complaints in 18 months, all dismissed because your supervisor believed you were simply maintaining standards. Because I was maintaining standards. And when you told Jamal that the kitchen staff are there because they lack the skills or intelligence, was that a standard too? Her face blanched. I was there every day this week, I said calmly. I heard you call hard-working people maintenance labor. I watched you learn nothing but the art of blame. She shot to her feet, the mask dropping away. This is entrapment. You can't spy on employees. I can observe the culture of the company I built, and what I saw was this: an employee who systematically targets older workers, believes social status determines human worth, and lacks the basic empathy required for leadership. You're doing this because of that dinner, she spat. Pure personal revenge. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. I built this company on one belief. Innovation grows from respect for every perspective. Intelligence takes many forms. Value isn't measured by age or pedigree. I turned back. You are the antithesis of those beliefs. Keisha tapped lightly, set down a tray of water, and slipped out. The room fell utterly still. Outside, the executive floor hummed along. Inside, an ethical surgery was underway. To save or to excise? The viewer would wonder, which path would Sienna choose? What now? Sienna's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Are you going to fire me? That depends on you. Hope flickered in her eyes. You mean, you have 2 options. 1, remain in the kitchen long enough to feel what it's like to be treated the way you treated others. Perhaps you'll finally grasp the impact of your behavior. 2, resign today. I'll provide a neutral reference letter citing your marketing capabilities and omitting the reason for departure. She studied me for a long time, weighing her odds. Then she spoke, laying her nature bare. That's blackmail. You're using your position to punish me because I didn't know who you were. I'm giving you a chance to leave with what's left of your dignity. My dignity? Her voice climbed. You made me wash dishes for a week. You humiliated me. I applied the very standards you've so often imposed on others. The difference is, they never had a choice, you do. She moved toward the door, then swung back, her face twisted with anger. Malcolm will hear about this. He'll learn what kind of person his mother is. Malcolm will learn the truth, I said, that his wife systematically bullied older employees and called security to eject his mother from his son's birthday. Her hand froze on the doorknob. And he'll also learn, I continued, that when offered the chance to take responsibility and grow, you chose blame, chose to play the victim. You're destroying my marriage. Your marriage isn't my responsibility, Sienna. Your character is. She stood another beat, chest heaving. When she spoke again, her voice was cool and calculating. I choose the kitchen. I'll stay there, and I'll prove this is nothing but a petty vendetta. Malcolm will see it. Fine, I nodded slowly. Monday, report to the cafeteria. Same shift, same station. The door closed. I sat down, feeling older than 68. I had hoped that the mask-ripping moment would trigger self-reflection, but Sienna chose defiance and delusion. She would return to the kitchen not to learn, but to endure, painting herself as the victim of a spiteful old woman, blind to the fact that today's circumstances were the direct consequence of yesterday's cruelty. My phone buzzed. A message from Malcolm. Can we meet for lunch, Mom? Sienna wants to talk to you. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I'm busy today. Another time. I knew what she would say. reveal my identity, cling to family ties to escape consequences, twist Malcolm against his mother with a victim's tale about unreasonable expectations, but that conversation would happen on my terms, not hers. And when it did, my son would face some hard truths about the woman he married and about the mother he failed to stand up for. The calculation was far from over. 3 weeks passed in a silence taut as a violin string. Malcolm called me 3 times. Each time came with a half-formed apology and excuses for Sienna. I gently declined every invitation to meet. During that time, I kept observing, not in disguise anymore, but through reports from Carla and Jamal. After I promoted Lorraine and brought Margaret back to the day shift, they began to trust me. Sienna was still in the kitchen, not like an apprentice, but like someone counting down the days. She barely spoke beyond what was necessary, worked inside a hard, simmering quiet, her face a mask of resentment. Every evening, Malcolm told me later, she came home and poured venom on the crazy woman on the executive floor who was taking revenge for no reason. She never told Malcolm that the crazy woman was his mother. Exactly 3 weeks after the confrontation, Malcolm called. His voice was tight, heavy, like someone forced to look a hard truth in the face. "Mom, we need to talk, all 3 of us." I set my teacup down, hearing the tremor in his voice. "About what exactly?" "About Sienna's job. About what happened at Cameron's birthday. About everything." He hesitated. Behind him was the muffled whisper of a hand over a mic, no doubt Sienna feeding him lines. "She told me who you are." "And how do you feel about that?" A long silence. "Confused? Angry? I don't understand why you didn't tell me you own the company she works for." "You never asked what kind of business I run, Malcolm. You assumed, like she did." "That's not the point, Mom. The issue is that you manipulated her employment, punished her over a family matter." I closed my eyes. Even now, after knowing the truth, he reflexively defended his wife. "Is that what she told you?" "She says you made her wash dishes for weeks as a kind of payback. That's not the mother I know." "Then maybe you don't know me as well as you think, just as you don't know your wife as well as you think." "What do you mean?" "I mean we speak face to face tonight. My apartment, 8 o'clock. They arrived 15 minutes late. Sienna was clearly prepared. Styled hair, flawless makeup, an outfit curated to broadcast, competent professional under siege. Malcolm looked exhausted, caught between 2 women he loved but didn't yet understand. I poured coffee in the small living room, the modest apartment I'd lived in for 10 years. The contrast with their spacious suburban home was obvious to anyone. "Mom," Malcolm began, settling onto the worn sofa, "Sienna's told me some worrying things about work." "I'm sure she has." I remained standing, hands clasped behind my back. "What exactly did she say?" Sienna leaned forward, her expression mixing just the right amounts of hurt and resolve. "I said you're using your power to humiliate me. You moved me to the worst job as punishment for a family disagreement." "A family disagreement?" I repeated slowly. "That's what you call it?" "Mom," Malcolm cut in, "however Cameron's birthday went, using the business to settle personal scores isn't right. That's not like you." "You're right. It's not like the mother you know, but it's exactly like the CEO I've always been." I walked to the window and looked down at the city lights. "Tell me, Malcolm, what do you know about Sienna's record?" "She's successful, ambitious, building a career. She has 3 complaints related to older employees in 18 months. She's created a hostile environment for anyone over 50. She systematically presses down on people she considers beneath her." "That's a legitimate professional concern," Sienna snapped. "You told Jamal the kitchen workers don't have the skills or intelligence to do anything better. You called them maintenance labor." I turned to face her. "You also said Lorraine probably didn't finish high school, and you insinuated Carla was an illegal immigrant." Malcolm's face drained. "Sienna, is that true?" I was frustrated. People say things under pressure. Like when you were stressed about the party? I asked softly. Like when you called La Pobre Vieja away from the table? What's that? Malcolm looked at me, bewildered. Poor old woman in Spanish, I explained. The phrase your wife used for me before demanding I leave my grandson's birthday. Silence crashed down. Malcolm's face shifted through emotions I'd seen when he was small, the look of a belief shattering. You called my mother a poor old woman? Sienna's eyes darted, hunting for an exit. Malcolm, you have to understand. She showed up looking... I didn't know who she was. So not knowing gives you the right to humiliate her? His voice broke. To throw my mother out of our house because she didn't meet your standards? Malcolm, please, you don't understand. Oh, I understand. He sprang to his feet, pacing. My wife kicked my mother out of Cameron's birthday because she was ashamed of how she looked. My wife bullies older, people at work. And when consequences came due, my wife went home and painted herself as the victim. If you've ever had to choose between blood and truth, whom would you choose? In this moment, Malcolm had to decide who he really was. She's manipulative, Sienna fired back. She pretended to be a janitor. In her own company, Malcolm said through his teeth, to observe an employee with repeated complaints. He turned to me. About those complaints, are they real, Mom? I nodded. 3 formal complaints in 18 months. All dismissed because her supervisor called it high standards. Malcolm looked back at his wife. The last illusion in his eyes cracked. So every night you claimed you were being targeted. What you were really facing were the consequences of your own behavior. You don't understand corporate life. Sometimes you have to be tough. Malcolm's voice choked. You called security, Sienna. You humiliated my mother in front of 20 people. You made our son watch his grandmother be thrown out of his birthday. I was protecting our family's reputation. Protecting it from whom? From the woman who worked 3 jobs to put me through school? From the kindest person I know? Sienna shot to her feet, face blazing with anger and desperation. She's no saint. Look at where she lives. Look at how she dresses. She's an embarrassment. The words slapped the air like bitter smoke. Malcolm stared for a long moment, then spoke in a voice frighteningly calm. Get out. What? Get out of my mother's apartment now. Before I say something I'll regret. Malcolm, you can't be serious. Never been more serious. He opened the door. Go home. Pack. Custody. We'll let the lawyers handle it. Sienna turned to me, eyes wild. This is what you wanted, isn't it? You wanted to destroy my marriage. I met her gaze. I wanted you to understand that actions have consequences, that degrading people because you think they're beneath you is unacceptable. I wanted you to learn a little basic human dignity. Instead, you've destroyed everything. No. You began destroying it the moment you decided my grandson would be better off without his grandmother. The moment you chose cruelty over kindness. The moment you forced Malcolm to choose between his wife and his conscience. Sienna flicked her eyes between us one last time, found no lifeline, snatched up her bag, and rushed out. This isn't over, she hissed. It is, I said softly. It's over. The door clicked shut. Malcolm collapsed into the chair she'd just vacated, head in his hands. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of 20 years of mistakes settling between mother and son. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered at last. I'm sorry for everything. I know you are. How long have you known who she really is? I suspected from the start, but I hoped I was wrong. I hoped love would make her better. He looked up, eyes rimmed red. What now? Now you rebuild. Focus on being the father Cameron needs. Remember who you were before the compromises. And Sienna? She'll find her way. She always does. Can you forgive me for letting her treat you that way? I moved closer and took his hand. You're my son. There's nothing to forgive. Even as I said it, I knew trust takes time. Some wounds knit quickly, others become scars, and scars change us forever. Cameron keeps asking, "When is Grandma coming over? Will she teach me to bake cookies? Will she tell the princess story?" Malcolm gave a small laugh, the first genuine smile I'd seen on him in years. "What did you tell him?" "I told him Grandma is building a castle and fighting dragons. He decided you're the most powerful person he knows." "Smart kid." I laughed, and for the first time since Cameron's birthday, tears finally spilled. But last week he asked why his mom moved out. I didn't know what to say. "What did you say?" "I told him sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and those mistakes mean they have to live somewhere else for a while. He asked if she's coming back. I said, I don't know. Was that wrong? Should I have been more decisive?" I squeezed his hand. "You told the truth in a way a child can understand. That's what a father should do." "Thank you, Mom," Malcolm said, voice heavy, "for never giving up on me, for being there when I wasn't there for you. You're my son, Malcolm. Nothing changes that." We sat a while longer, beginning the slow work of repair. And I realized this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, rebuilding our relationship with truth instead of pretense, with respect instead of shame, with love instead of obligation. It will take time, but now we have time. Now. 6 months later, I sat in my office on a crisp autumn morning, reading the quarterly reports. Lakefront Dynamics continued its steady growth. Sunlight poured through the glass, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk, where I had made countless decisions over the years. Keisha knocked, carrying coffee and the morning stack of mail. "Mrs. Baylor, there's a resignation letter from Food Services." I knew before I opened it. Sienna's neat, spare handwriting filled a page. A resignation effective immediately. Personal reasons and the pursuit of new opportunities. No acknowledgement of lessons learned, no expression of remorse, no growth, just an exit designed to preserve what little face remained. I signed the approval without hesitation. Some people learn from consequences. Some endure them only until they find an escape hatch. Keisha, process this today and remind HR, exit interviews are mandatory for all supervisory roles, no exceptions. Over the past 6 months, I'd changed far more than the story of one toxic employee. Reworked reporting lines so all bullying complaints land directly on my desk. Sensitivity training for the entire management layer. Lorraine Jeffers was promoted to floor supervisor. Her experience and wisdom finally put where they belong. Margaret Chen returned to the day shift. With a commendation in her file, Robert Williams led the IT infrastructure upgrade. His decades of experience shone. The culture was changing, slowly but surely. The phone rang. Malcolm. "Hi, Mom. Are you free for lunch today? Cameron wants to show you something." Between my son and me, the relationship was knitting back together bit by bit, like a broken bone setting over time. The divorce went quickly. Sienna had moved back in with her parents in another state. Perhaps easier to start over somewhere new than to face consequences here, where people knew the truth. Of course, the usual place. "Cameron wants a picnic at Maggie Daly Park. He's been practicing a little performance for you." An hour later, I spread a blanket beneath an oak Cameron tore around the playground, laughter rippling over the grass. Malcolm looked healthier than he had in years, the constant tension no longer weighting his shoulders. "Grandma, look!" Cameron hung upside down from the bar with the serene fearlessness only a 5-year-old has. "Careful, sweetheart," I called, warmth rising in me at the simple joy of getting to worry over him. Malcolm sat beside me and took sandwiches from a paper bag. Every day, Cameron asks, "When is Grandma coming? Will she teach me to bake cookies? Will she tell the princess story?" "What do you tell him?" "I tell him Grandma is building a castle and fighting dragons." He smiled, the first unguarded smile I'd seen in years. "He's decided you're the most powerful person he knows." I laughed, watching Cameron conquer the playground. Smart child. Sometimes too smart, Malcolm said, opening a juice box with deliberate care. Last week, he asked why his mother moved out. This is the hardest part, protecting a child's innocence while staying truthful. What did you say? I told him the truth within what he can grasp. Sometimes adults don't treat each other well. Sometimes families take different shapes. But love doesn't change. I squeezed his hand. You did very well. I'm trying, but it's hard, Mom. He wants to know why there aren't 3 of us anymore. I explain without planting bitterness toward his mother? I finished for him. Exactly. Whatever else, she's still Cameron's mom. That's the right approach. He'll form his own judgments as he grows. Your job is to make sure he always feels loved and safe. Grandma, come see the castle I built. Cameron tugged me toward a sand fortress assembled from sticks and shells, clever enough to impress any architect. I glanced around. Grandparents pushing swings, parents chasing toddlers. The messy, beautiful ordinary. That's what I'd fought to keep, not revenge or vindication, but the right to be present in my grandson's world, unapologetically, seen for who I am, not sidelined for what I am not. If you've ever been stripped of your place in your own family, what would you do to reclaim it without losing your kindness? Hold that question. The next part tells how we turned wounds into a legacy. When father and son drove off, I stood in my small apartment, looking at the photo wall. Cameron through the years, Malcolm's graduation, celebrations from before Sienna entered our lives. Now there were new pictures. Me and Cameron baking cookies, pitching a blanket fort, reading stories, a life regained. A text from Jamal Pierce, the kitchen kid who'd become an unexpected friend. Mrs. Baylor, Carla's grandson graduated valedictorian. She asked me to thank you for the scholarship. I smiled. Congratulations. Hard work deserves recognition. The scholarship program was the newest initiative, tuition support for children and grandchildren of long-tenured employees. People like Carla, who spent 20 years keeping the company humming, deserve to see their families move forward. Another message from Lorraine Jeffers. There's a night shift supervisor opening in Building B. Should I apply? Might need someone to vouch for my ethics. I chuckled. I know just the person to write that letter. As evening deepened, I cooked a simple dinner and curled up on the sofa with a book. The quiet in my apartment was no longer a pressing silence, but peace. I thought of Sienna, somewhere out there, and felt something odd, not gloating, but sorrow for the chances she'd squandered. She could have learned something in that kitchen. She could have cultivated empathy, grown, rebuilt her marriage to Malcolm on respect instead of social climbing. But she chose to script herself as the victim, to flee responsibility, not understanding that freedom lies in the courage to be accountable. The phone rang again. Malcolm. Cameron wants to say goodnight to Grandma. He's worried you'll be lonely. Cameron's voice piped up behind him. Tell Grandma dragons are afraid of the dark, so she should leave a light on. Tell him Grandma will leave a light on, I laughed. And Malcolm, thank you. For what? For choosing to look at the truth when it mattered most. I did turn on a small kitchen light, not because I fear dragons, but because Cameron worries for me. To be worried over is a privilege I nearly lost. I lay down and thought about power, not from titles or status, but from knowing your worth and refusing to accept less. The power to stand up for yourself and for others, even when it's hard. The power to choose dignity over convenience, truth over comfort. Sienna once believed power meant belittling others, climbing social rungs, marrying into a family she scorned. She confused cruelty with strength, manipulation with intelligence. True power, lasting power, comes from lifting people up, using your position to protect those who can't protect themselves, recognizing every person's worth regardless of age, accent, education, or title. I built Lakefront Dynamics on those principles 35 years ago, and I will defend them with my last breath. I'll rise early, go back to the office, and keep building a culture of respect and dignity. I'll review scholarship applications, approve well-earned promotions, and ensure old mistakes don't repeat. And tonight, I'll sleep the peaceful sleep of someone who fought for what matters, and won not through revenge, but through calm, consistent consequences, through an unshakable belief that everyone deserves basic dignity. I reclaimed my place in my family and my company. I shielded others from the treatment I once endured. And most importantly, I showed my grandson that his grandmother is truly powerful, not because she can harm, but because she chooses to help. That is the kind of power worth having, the kind that builds a legacy, that lights rather than darkens, that lets you sleep well, knowing you did what was right. And you, the one hearing this story, what would you do in my place? Have you faced something similar? Have you ever had to choose between family and principle? Have you had to stand up when no one else would? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. While you're here, I'm leaving 2 more stories on the screen. Trust me, they'll surprise you. Thank you for watching to the end. Remember, a person's worth isn't measured by money, clothes, or connections, but by how they treat those who cannot repay them. That is true power, that is true dignity, and no one can take it from you. If this story moved you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. One tap from you helps these stories travel farther. See you soon.